Hello and welcome to this month's Part-Time Grappler podcast with me, your host, Liam Wandi. In this podcast, I will share some of the many lessons I've learned from the various martial arts teachers I've been lucky to meet and train with over the years, thanks to the blog, The Part-Time Grappler. I will also share some of the ideas that my training as a secondary school teacher, that's what I do for a living, has fostered in me, whether that's regarding structuring a curriculum, teaching methodology, time management, or even lesson structure for those of us who teach martial arts in any capacity. I hope you enjoy listening to these podcasts as much as I enjoy making them. So, without further ado, I hand you over to myself and this month's Part-Time Grappler podcast. In today's podcast, I want to spend a little time talking about private lessons or private sessions, one-to-ones, mainly from a jiu-jitsu point of view, but it applies to any other area of learning. Mainly a couple of questions that I feel you should ask yourself and the instructor before attending your first one-to-one jiu-jitsu private session. One of the best things that separates Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu from just about every other sport on the planet is that the top instructors, the top competitors are all accessible to the general public, mostly. You can schedule a private lesson with just about anyone at the top echelon, and sometimes it can even be at a reasonable cost. At the very least, you can attend seminars, but that's a topic for another discussion. Private sessions are themselves an excellent solution for time constraints on regular training. For example, many of my students who take regular privates, their work schedule or their life schedule or something prevents them from attending a regular training schedule at an academy, while for others it's more of a booster, so they would be training at a regular academy and they need 4 or 5 sessions on a particular topic to see if they can boost their understanding of it. So maybe they've hit a plateau with a particular area that then they want to work through. Before you schedule your first private session with me or with any jiu-jitsu teacher, I recommend that you ask yourself and you ask the instructor some of the following questions. So a few questions that I feel you should ask yourself. The first one is why. It is vital that you know exactly why you are organizing this training opportunity. Why now, and why with this particular instructor? It is not advisable at all to just show up to your first private and ask the instructor, what do you think we should work on? It doesn't matter how well you know them. It doesn't matter how well they know you. It's just unfair on them, and more importantly, unfair on you to just show up like that. I must add, however, that if you decide to continue with that instructor and do regular, by which I mean monthly or ideally weekly privates, then yes, it would be best to discuss the objectives with them. And then 5 or 6 sessions in, it's absolutely fine to hand over that responsibility to them. So at least ask to see some kind of a semblance of a curriculum or a scheme of a learning plan, a long-term learning plan. The first time, then you should definitely ask yourself, why am I doing this? And discuss it with the instructor as well. Why am I doing this? Why am I doing this now? Why am I doing this with this particular instructor? But after a while, if you do regular privates with me, for example, it becomes my responsibility to look after the continued development of my students. The other question that I feel you should ask yourself before scheduling your first private is what? What do you expect to achieve from the private? To be completely honest, this is an open question and there are no right or wrong answers except for one, and that is not really sure. It kind of links in with the previous question you should ask yourself. If nothing else, this can be an exercise in decisiveness, and a lot of people could do with work and decisiveness. Pick an area that you enjoy, even if it's an area that you suck at, ideally one of those, to be honest. And ask the instructor the following 3 questions. Question number 1. How am I ending up here? So it could be, for example, the mount bottom, or you land in side control top. Ask yourself, how am I ending up here? What are the events, what are the chain of events that are leading to me ending up here? Second question, how could I improve that process of getting there? So if we're talking about the mount top, how could I improve my mounting technique? Maybe from the side, maybe after a throw, maybe from a guard pass. How can I improve that? If we're talking about an inferior position, for example, under the side control, or the side mount, or the cross side, however you want to call it, then you could ask yourself, how can I improve the process of getting there? Fine, I accept my guard's getting past, or somehow I'm getting in side control bottom, but maybe I can end up there with a on my side rather than flat on my back, with an elbow between me, framing between me and the opponent, or with a knee, or something. And the last question is, once I'm there, what are my best options? So once I'm in the mount top or the bottom or the side mount, what are my best options to go to? So if you ask yourself and the instructor these questions, then you should be on your way to having a good understanding of what it is you are trying to achieve from the private session. Okay, the other question you should ask yourself is, how often? I mean, over the years as a teacher, both as a mathematics teacher or within martial arts, I've had students whom I've taught once or twice. It was just to address one particular problem they had maybe. Sometimes that one session was enough, and sometimes life got in the way of training together again. So maybe they moved, I moved, something happened, and we couldn't train more than once or twice together. But most of my private students, I'm very lucky to say, over the years, I have worked with for extensive periods of time. We're talking once or twice a week for 2 years or over, the majority of my students. In a training relationship like that, they no longer need to constantly ask themselves what they want out of the sessions, how should they achieve. That becomes my responsibility. They do, however, need to ask themselves regularly why they choose to train with me. What kind of benefits end up being added to their jiu-jitsu and ultimately their life. I truly believe that jiu-jitsu can be life transforming if we allow it. If they choose to continue, then it is important that they factor in things like time, or this, time spent training, but also time spent traveling to and from sessions. It's important that they factor in effort. It's important that they factor in energy. Often people come straight after work or on a weekend. It's important that they factor in cost. All these things need to be factored in. That is why it always feels like a huge honor when someone chooses to come and spend their time learning with me. So these are questions that I feel you must ask yourself. As for the instructor, there's a few questions that I feel you should ask your instructor, and they will be more than happy to provide the answers. Trust me. First one is, will I need to bring a notepad or any other pieces of equipment? Will a gi be provided? What is a gi? Do you teach mainly for self-defense or for sport? Oh my God, there's a sport element. How does that element work? Will the private session include sparring? Do I need to bring a partner for drilling and for sparring? Does the facility have a shower? Every single one of the above questions, I mean, that's a short, non-conclusive list by any measure. But every single one of these questions that I just mentioned, I have been asked over the years from prospective students. That is why I'm very strict about one particular ritual when it comes to private students, and I always follow this. I will never ever step on the mat with a student to do a private lesson unless we've been for a coffee. Ideally on a day other than the day of the private. So not just, let's go for a coffee, now straight away go to the private. Usually a day or two before, or maybe even a week before. It doesn't matter. Not only does this give me a chance to know a little bit more about the person, about their wants and their needs and expectations out of the session, the background within jiu-jitsu, all these things, but more importantly for the student, it gives them the chance to ask me all these questions that we mentioned above and to have answers and be ready for the session. So try to organize some time with the instructor before the session if you can to go through all these questions. Another question that you could ask the instructor before is, how do I need to prepare? Don't worry, I'm not suggesting any homework or anything like that, but maybe, there's not much a student needs to prepare ahead for a private session, ahead of a private session, unless it is a very narrow focus for the session. And it's been decided by the student that, can we analyze my last match at the last competition? Can we work on my throws, on one particular throw, a drop suinagi, for example? Can we study defense against punches from the close guard, for example? And again, these are examples that I've taken from private lessons I've taught. In that case, I know as an instructor, I will arrive prepared. So I would have gone over both my material, my delivery method, the drills I'm going to use. I would have even packed necessary equipment if I feel I need it. For example, a phone or a tablet that we can view that match that they mentioned on, or a YouTube clip. Maybe some rubber bands if you're going to be working on throw training. Maybe even a pair of reasonably sized gloves that we can use for punch protection from the close guard. I would do that preparation, but I would then also expect the student to have re-studied their match, or studied some of the drop tsunagi examples that I would have sent them in advance. Ideally, bring their own gloves and of course gum shield. The better prepared both of us are, then the more we will get out of the session that we are signing up to. What else? What's next? Will the session have a sparring element? The number of times I've taught private lessons, especially the first or the second private lesson, and we've used the full hour, or however long we've decided the session would be. Most of the time it's an hour, and we've not really done any sparring. For me, sparring is a gift, and it should be treated as such. It's not a compulsory part of any session. And the same thing for the student. They might not necessarily be there for sparring. Maybe they want to work on particular details of a particular technique. If the session was pre-discussed as sparring centric, then yeah, absolutely. If they wanted to drill a particular technique under the pressures of sparring, yeah, absolutely. And linking to that is, will we have time to practice and drill the techniques from the day? Personally, ideally, this should always be a yes. If I'm going to teach you a technique, then there's no point in us spending the time and the money and the effort to do the session if you're not going to have time to practice the techniques and drill them so they become second nature. But sometimes the student has a lot of questions that they want to address, and then they want to go back to their home academy, open mat sessions or whatever, grab a partner and practice and drill the things that I showed them. Naturally, as a teacher, I respect that. But I feel it's best to discuss that with the instructor before the private session. Okay, folks, that brings us to the end of this month's podcast. If you have any feedback, I would love to hear it. You can find my email through either the blog or my own personal website. Both of which you can find simply by Googling either the Part-Time Grappler or my name, Liam Wandi. That's LIAMWANDI. These two sites are also the best place to find out more about academies I'll be visiting, or upcoming seminars or competitions I'm doing or participating in. And of course, if you're there as well, it would be really cool to meet up. Thanks again to all those who download and listen to this podcast. I really appreciate it. And if you could go to iTunes and Stitcher, or however which way you choose to listen to this podcast, and subscribe to it, and of course give us a 5-star rating, then the next time I meet you, I promise to give you a hug, or at least a firm handshake, depending on your preference. Okay, thank you very much for listening.